Hello, my dear masterminds. They notice it in the way rooms change when you enter. Even before you speak, the air doesn't shift dramatically. It tightens quietly. Conversations adjust their rhythm without anyone acknowledging why. Eyes lift just a fraction longer than necessary. People pause between sentences, as if listening for something beneath the sound, and they all feel it before they ever understand it. You walk through your days thinking you're moving unnoticed, thinking you're just another figure in the background of a larger scene, while the truth operates in reverse. You are the reference point they calibrate against without your consent. They don't announce it, they don't explain it. They observe, they measure, they compare. And slowly, subtly, they adjust their behavior in your presence without ever telling you why. That's the first sign of a power you haven't recognized yet. You assume silence means nothing is happening. You assume lack of attention means lack of impact. You assume if no one says anything, there's nothing to respond to. But power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it registers as unease. Sometimes it registers as respect, disguised as distance. Sometimes it registers as hesitation you mistake for disinterest. They all sense something you don't see yet. Not because you're unaware, but because your power is so natural to you that you confuse it with normal. You grew used to moving with weight long before you learned what weight felt like to others. You learned to carry pressure before you realized it was pressure at all. So when people hesitate near you, you assume they're uncertain. When they speak carefully, you assume they're polite. When they shift direction after you move, you assume coincidence. You don't see the pattern yet, but they do. They've watched how outcomes bend when you make decisions without forcing them. They've seen how conflict cools without confrontation around you. They've noticed how attention subtly redirects once your presence registers in the environment. None of this feels dramatic to you. It feels ordinary. That's what makes it dangerous. Because the most powerful advantages are the ones you never learn to label. And when you don't label them, you don't exploit them. You don't defend them. You don't aim them. You simply operate from them unconsciously. That's why they know more about your impact than you do, right now. They study results. You only feel intention. They track the effects of your movement. You only feel the steps. That difference is everything. Somewhere along the line, people stopped trying to test you directly. They began testing the space around you instead. They changed timing. They adjusted positioning. They altered their approach without ever declaring the reason. You think you've been overlooked. In truth, you've been categorized quietly as something that doesn't respond predictably to pressure. And when pressure fails as leverage, observation becomes the only remaining strategy. That's why they all seem to know something about you that you don't yet see. Not because they're smarter, but because distance gives perspective that immersion denies. You are inside the movement. They are watching its consequences ripple outward. You still think power looks like force. They already know it looks like gravity. At first, they didn't trust what they were seeing. Patterns like yours don't fit into familiar categories. You weren't loud. You weren't aggressive. You didn't seize attention or demand acknowledgement. There was no obvious desire for control in you. And that confused them, because they're trained to recognize ambition by its noise. They're trained to fear challenges that announce themselves early. But you didn't arrive like a warning siren. You arrived like a quiet adjustment to reality that only became obvious after the effect had already taken place. That's why the early observations stayed private, shared in half sentences, in raised eyebrows, in subtle changes of tone when your name came up. They didn't say watch them, they said something's different. And that single sentence carries more weight than any accusation ever could. You kept moving the way you always have, making decisions without drama, choosing paths that made sense to you without advertising them. Meanwhile, the consequences kept stacking up in ways that made people uncomfortable. Situations around you stabilized faster than expected. Conflicts lost momentum without explanation. Opportunities appeared in your wake that didn't follow normal chains of cause and effect. None of this felt supernatural. It felt like inevitability disguised as coincidence. That's the kind of pattern people don't dismiss for long. So they began to replay interactions, revisiting conversations you barely remember, watching how others reacted when you left a room, studying how plans shifted after you stepped out of a process rather than into one. They noticed that things didn't fall apart without you, but they did behave differently, less volatile, more precise, as if a variable had been removed that made outcomes harder to predict. And the more they watched, the more one unsettling conclusion formed, quietly, at the edges of their awareness. You don't operate on reaction. You operate on alignment. When pressure comes towards you, it doesn't find resistance, it finds redirection. When influence tries to limit you, it discovers you're no longer where it expected you to be. And when outcomes try to entangle you, they realize too late that you were never emotionally hooked to begin with. That absence of entanglement is what makes your movements look effortless. Not because they are easy, but because you are unowned. Most people leak energy into conflict. You contain it. Most people escalate when challenged. You refine. Most people get louder when uncertain. You get quieter, and that quiet is what unsettles them. Because silence is where projection thrives. They don't know what you'll do next because you don't rehearse the version of yourself they expect. You don't perform consistency for their comfort. You remain coherent with yourself instead. That's why they began sharing their observations in coded language. They don't move how others move. You can't rush them. They don't react on schedule. None of that sounds threatening on the surface. But beneath it is a truth they won't say out loud yet. You are not easy to catch in prediction, and what can't be predicted can't be efficiently controlled. You still think power announces itself through visibility, through recognition, through title. They already understand it through something more dangerous, through autonomy, through the way cause and effect behave differently around you, through the way even your absence alters the direction of events. That's why they know something about your power before you do. They've been tracking the shadow it casts. Eventually, observation turned into quiet recalibration. They stopped trying to figure you out in the way people usually do. No more surface analysis, no more personality profiling. They shifted to something colder, outcome tracking. They mapped results instead of motives. They watched what happened in environments you passed through without becoming involved. And what they discovered unsettled them. You don't dominate situations by force. You alter the conditions that make domination unnecessary. When people try to compete with you, they feel late before the contest even begins. When they try to resist you, they realize resistance has nowhere to anchor because you never push directly. And that unsettles systems built on opposition. Because systems survive by identifying opponents. You don't behave like an opponent. You behave like a misalignment, they can't correct. That's why people close to power grew cautious. They learned that challenging you openly only strengthened your position. They learned that ignoring you didn't erase your effect. Quietly, relentlessly, as if momentum itself were taking instruction from a source they couldn't trace. So they adapted. They stopped trying to confront you and started trying to position themselves relative to you. That's the moment you shifted from unknown variable to reference marker. People measure themselves against what they fear becoming irrelevant to, and you were quietly becoming unavoidable. You still didn't see it. You still believed you were moving through the same space as everyone else under the same rules. But they already understood you had begun operating under a different contract. One not written on paper, one written in consequence. You weren't climbing their structure. You were becoming the gravity that made their structure tilt. That's why invitations began to replace challenges, not out of politeness, out of calculation. They learned that testing you produced no satisfying reaction, only delayed outcome shifts they couldn't control afterward. You didn't defend yourself in the ways they expected. You let their attempts reveal themselves through overreach. And overreach always exposes weakness. The deeper truth they were approaching but still refusing to say aloud was this: you don't seek advantage. You generate inevitability. Advantage can be contested. Inevitability cannot. They tried to catch you in a mistake that would humanize you in the wrong way. Something impulsive, something reckless, something reactive. But all they found were moments of restraint, where others would have rushed, pauses where others would have pushed, silence where others would have shouted. And in each of those moments, their own behavior exposed more than yours ever did. Your power didn't come from dominance. It came from the discipline to remain unowned by reaction. That's what still separates you from seeing it clearly. You think power looks like assertion. They already know it looks like independence. And independence at scale becomes command without voice. That's the truth forming behind their eyes now. They don't fully understand you yet, but they no longer doubt your impact. And once doubt disappears, respect begins to change shape. Respect didn't arrive the way they expected it to. It didn't come as alarm. It didn't show itself as resistance. It arrived as acknowledgement wrapped in distance. People who once spoke freely around you began choosing their words with more care. Not because you intimidated them directly, but because they sensed that meaning traveled differently once it passed through your presence. They felt that what they said near you somehow counted more. And when words start to feel heavier, people grow cautious with how they release them. That was the next shift they noticed. You didn't change. Their behavior did. They started timing their moves around yours without ever admitting it. They delayed decisions when you were quiet, anticipating that your silence meant motion and preparation. They sped up actions when you stepped forward, afraid to be late to a direction they couldn't yet read. You became the quiet metronome of rooms you never tried to conduct. And the most unnerving part for them was this: you weren't interested in controlling the tempo at all. You simply moved when alignment was present and stayed still when it wasn't. That kind of discipline dissolves the illusion of urgency most people live by. You showed them, without teaching, that nothing truly important rushes. And once someone understands that, they stop being easily manipulated by pressure. That's when power structures begin to lose their grip, because urgency is the oldest leash in existence. They watched how you never responded to appeals, never escalated when challenged, never performed intensity to prove engagement. You allowed moments to expire without chasing them. And the moments you didn't chase grew in meaning instead of shrinking. That reversal confused them deeply. They're taught that attention must be seized. You demonstrated that it can also be cultivated through restraint. Slowly, they realized why they felt unsettled in your orbit. You didn't mirror their energy. You didn't amplify their chaos. You absorbed nothing that wasn't essential. And that made their own inner noise painfully visible by contrast. People don't avoid silence because it's empty. They avoid it because it reflects what they can't hide from themselves. And you carry silence in a way that reflects without accusation. That's far more unsettling than confrontation. They began to sense that your awareness extended beyond what you acknowledged openly. That even when you said little, you saw far more than you revealed. And when people believe they are seen without being exposed, they grow uncertain of what they can afford to risk in your presence. That uncertainty granted you a kind of leverage you never asked for. They tested it carefully. Small misdirections, subtle deceptions, shifts in narrative meant to measure how quickly you detected distortion. But each time they attempted to tilt the field without your noticing, the outcomes betrayed them. Events corrected themselves. Stories failed under their own inconsistency. Timelines realigned in ways that erased the advantage they tried to secure. They began to suspect that even when you appeared uninvolved, you were still integrated into the larger pattern of consequence. Not as a manipulator, but as a stabilizing constant. That's when the thought they avoided naming began to crystallize. What if your power isn't in what you do? What if it's in what reality does when you remain coherent within it? That question disturbed them more than any display of control ever could. Because control can be challenged. Coherence cannot. Once that realization settled in, everything they thought they understood about influence began to distort. They were used to power that announced itself through force, through hierarchy, through pressure applied loudly enough that obedience became survival. What you carried didn't resemble that at all. There was no visible mechanism behind it, no apparatus to dismantle, no command chain to interrupt. You didn't impose structure on others. You remained structured within yourself. And that internal structure began shaping outcomes externally, without effort. They noticed how people leaned toward your conclusions even before you articulated them. How decisions aligned with your unspoken perspective, as if consensus had been reached silently ahead of time. They watched conversations pivot mid-sentence simply because your presence altered what felt true enough to say. None of this was dramatic. That's what made it so absolute. Drama fades fast and leaves nothing. What you generated was slow recalibration, the kind that settles into place and stays. They attempted to define you with labels to contain the discomfort. Strategist, observer, unpredictable force, outlier. None of it held. Every definition reduced your range in a way reality refused to cooperate with. You didn't follow the logic of those categories because your movement wasn't driven by advantage-seeking alone. You moved from a position of internal clarity that made outcome chasing unnecessary. And that clarity is what unsettles those who survive by leverage. They rely on pressure points. You don't present any. They rely on incentives. You don't respond predictably to reward or consequence. They rely on escalation. You dissolve tension by refusing to feed it. The entire operating system they trust runs on reaction. Yours runs on alignment. That incompatibility is unfixable. Some tried to approach you with flattery. Once they felt resistance wouldn't work, they assumed admiration might soften your independence. But admiration requires need to function as leverage. You accepted acknowledgement without attaching your direction to it. That made their praise ineffective as a tool. Others attempted proximity as a strategy. If they couldn't redirect you, maybe they could at least ride your momentum. By the time this understanding settled fully into their awareness, the shift was already irreversible. What began as quiet observation had turned into silent concession. Not surrender in the dramatic sense, something deeper. Acceptance of a new gravity. They could no longer pretend wasn't shaping the field. They stopped asking why outcomes bent the way they did, and started factoring your presence into their calculations as an unstated variable. Not because you demanded to be accounted for, because ignoring you had become impossible. And that's the truth. They've been living in long before you chose to see it. Your power was never waiting to be activated. It was waiting to be recognized. And now, whether you acknowledge it or not, the world has already adjusted to the gravity you've become. Hello, my dear mastermind. They kept testing your limits because they were convinced you had some. They pressed, they pushed, they analyzed every angle of you like you were a puzzle they could eventually solve. People like them always assume strength has a ceiling. They assume confidence has a turning point. They assume discipline eventually folds under pressure. They assume focus eventually slips. They assume resilience eventually shifts. They always underestimate the one who grew in silence, the one who learned to adapt before they learned to speak, the one who didn't study strength, but survived it. They've been watching you like a lab subject, trying to find a vulnerability they can map out, a pattern they can predict, a button they can press, a moment you might slip. But the funny part, every test they threw at you only revealed them. Every challenge they set only revealed their own mindset. Every pressure they attempted to place on you revealed how delicate they truly are. They went searching for limits and ended up discovering their own. They thought you were like everyone else. They thought you'd fold where the average person shifts. They thought you'd ask where the average person bends. They thought you'd worry where the average person softens. But you're not built on the same timeline. You don't react on their frequency. You don't move within their expectations. You're a walking contradiction to everything their insecurities told them was possible. They study reactions, but you respond with silence. They expect frustration, but you answer with clarity. They push chaos, but you return with strategy. Your power was never loud. It was always felt. And once they felt it, they didn't know what to do with themselves. The truth is, nobody can measure a person who was shaped by the storms they never saw. Nobody can test the limits of someone who rebuilt themselves in private. Nobody can predict the steps of someone who learned the world from a different angle, not through comfort, but through pressure. They thought you were a normal opponent, someone they could exhaust over time, but you don't exhaust. You rewire, you recharge, you regenerate. They thought pressure would shift you, but pressure just organized you. They thought setbacks would remove you, but setbacks sharpened you. They thought doubt would slow you, but doubt became your blueprint. And now they stand there confused, because everything they used to test you became the very reason you outgrew them. They kept testing your limits, not realizing you'd already lived beyond them. They kept searching for your ceiling, not knowing you were built without one. They kept hoping you'd finally shift apart, without realizing you don't shift, you evolve. And every time they tried to pinpoint where your strength ends, the line simply moved further. That's not a coincidence. That's the difference between someone who pretends to be powerful and someone who earned it. Someone who collected lessons they were never ready for. Someone who didn't need approval because reality already approved them. They expected to find the boundary of you, but instead, they found the blueprint of something they can't replicate, can't control, can't contain. You're not limitless because you say you are. You're limitless because life forced you to become exactly that. They kept testing your limits because deep down, they needed confirmation. Confirmation that you were human like them, that you carried the same weaknesses, that you shifted under the same pressure, that you worried when things got real. But every time they pushed, every time they tried to pressure you, every time they attempted to throw you off balance, you didn't shift, you didn't fold, you didn't glitch, you didn't hesitate. You adjusted, you stabilized, you observed. And that concerned them more than anything. They expected reactions, but you responded with control. They expected unease, but you answered with awareness. They expected collapse, but you evolved mid-impact. That's when they realized you weren't the one being revealed. They were, see, people who come from comfort, misread people who come from pressure. They don't understand the kind of strength built in silence. They don't understand the type of focus sharpened in solitude. They don't understand the kind of resilience formed in storms that nobody else knew you were walking through. They're used to opponents who flinch, who get emotional, who lose control. But you're the opposite. The more chaotic the moment, the calmer you get. The more pressure they add, the more precise you become. The more they try to confuse you, the clearer your vision becomes. That's not strategy, that's nature. You didn't learn to be unshakable. You were shaped into it. They tried to push you to your limit, not because they wanted to see your weakness, but because they were uneasy about your strength. They needed proof you could be contained, that you could be controlled, that you could be redirected. They needed to believe you were just like the others, predictable, emotional, able to be shifted, but you respond from a depth they've never touched. You move from a place they've never seen. You operate from an instinct they can't decode. So when they pushed, you didn't get smaller. They did. When they challenged you, you didn't shrink. Their confidence did. When they underestimated you, you didn't get offended. Their entire perception scattered. Because the moment someone realizes you don't shift where others shift, they stop testing your limits and start questioning their own. And that's exactly what's happening now. They're not confused because you're strong. They're confused because they can't figure out where your strength comes from. They don't know the nights you rebuilt yourself. They don't know the barriers you faced alone. They don't know the past that sharpened you. They don't know the instincts you earned. They don't know the layers of evolution in your silence. And the truth is, they don't have to know. Your strength was never meant for their understanding. Your limits were never meant for their understanding. Your limits were never meant for their calculations. Your path was never meant for their approval. They wanted your breaking point. And instead, they found the border of their own abilities. They pushed you to discover your limits. Instead, they discovered they couldn't keep up. And now they're stuck replaying every moment, every conversation, every challenge, trying to figure out, where does your strength actually end? That question is exactly why you'll always stay 10 steps ahead. Because they're still searching for your ceiling, while you're already building your next floor. They kept probing, questioning, analyzing, trying to map out your reactions like you were some kind of predictable blueprint. But every time they thought they finally figured you out, you shifted again. Not out of strategy, not out of game playing, but because that's who you are. You're not static. You're not fixed. You're not a one-version soul. You evolve mid-moment, mid-pressure, mid-conversation. You're the kind of person who regenerates while others are still recovering. You adapt while they freeze. You transform while they complain. That's why they can't keep up. They're trying to decode a person who doesn't even stay in the same state long enough to be measured. What really unsettles them is this. You don't rise loudly, you rise suddenly. One moment you look normal. The next, you're operating on a frequency they don't even have the inner framework for. That's why they're confused. That's why they're unsettled. That's why they keep testing you. Because they don't understand how someone can stay so calm while carrying so much power. They don't get how someone can stay so quiet while winning so loudly. They don't get how someone can handle pressure that throws people twice your size off balance. And deep down, that's their biggest concern. You make their strength look staged, their confidence look borrowed, and their courage look rehearsed. They want to believe your calm is fake. They want to believe your clarity is luck. They want to believe your intuition is coincidence. But every time life throws a storm your way, you don't react the way they expect. You don't lose control. You don't worry. You don't fold. You watch. You process. You choose. Your silence becomes strategy. Your patience becomes leverage. Your restraint becomes presence. And that's the part they can't handle, because that means you're not controlled by the environment. The environment is controlled by how you move through it. People who lack depth don't understand people who carry oceans. They look at you and think you're hiding something, because they don't know what it's like to carry power without bragging about it. They don't know what it's like to see through lies without announcing it. They don't know what it's like to sense intentions before the words even land. They don't know what it's like to be built from experiences they've never navigated. So when you sit there silent, steady, unbothered, they start feeling uncertain. Not because you did something wrong, but because they suddenly realize just how much they miscalculated you. And that miscalculation is echoing in their mind. They're replaying every interaction, every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out how they missed the signs, how they mistook your humility for weakness, how they confused your quiet for emptiness, how they labeled your calm as inexperience. They didn't expect someone like you to carry strength behind your eyes and peace in your voice at the same time. They didn't expect someone like you to read rooms without saying a word. They didn't expect someone like you to thrive in situations meant to shake you. And now the truth is hitting them in waves. They weren't testing you to see your limits. They were testing you to reassure themselves that you had limits. But every test revealed them instead. Your clarity revealed their confusion. Your growth revealed their stagnation. Your intuition revealed their motives. Your resilience revealed their sensitivity. Now they're not asking, "How strong are you?" Now they're asking the question that really concerns them. How much stronger is he going to get? They kept thinking the tests were about you. They didn't realize the tests were exposing them. Because every time they tried to push your limits, you didn't bend the way they predicted. You didn't crack the way they expected. And you didn't react the way they rehearsed in their heads. Instead, your silence turned into reflection. Your distance turned into elevation. Your patience turned into transformation. And that's when everything around you started shifting. People, intentions, alliances, masks. See, when someone evolves faster than the room starts glitching. People don't know how to respond. Their old versions of you don't fit anymore. Their assumptions don't land. Their strategies fall flat. Their attempts to influence you bounce back. Their expectations dissolve. And suddenly they're forced to face a truth they weren't ready for. You outgrew the version of you they were comfortable with. That's why they switched up. That's why their energy changed. That's why their tone shifted. Not because you did something wrong, because they finally realized you're not who they built their illusions around. You're not who they assumed they could influence. You're not the person they thought would stay small enough to control. Your evolution didn't concern them because you changed. It concerned them because you changed without their permission. People get uncomfortable when they can no longer predict your reactions. They worry when they can't guide your emotions. They get defensive when their influence stops working. And that's exactly what happened. The more you grew, the more their masks thinned. The more aware you became, the more their intentions leaked. The more grounded you became, the more their insecurities surfaced. You didn't reveal them, your presence did. And now they're confused, not because you moved in a way that reveals who's genuine and who was just comfortable with the version of you that didn't know its own power. Your growth became a mirror, and mirrors are challenging for people who've been hiding from their own reflection. Suddenly they started acting weird, distant, jealous, unsettled. Not because you wronged them, but because your evolution highlighted everything inside them that was still stuck. And here's the part they'll never admit out loud. They didn't expect you to become someone they could no longer mislead. They didn't expect you to become someone they could no longer steer. They didn't expect you to become someone who sees straight through intentions, tone, silence, and energy. They didn't expect you to become someone they now have to respect, even if they don't want to. Your growth wasn't just personal, it was disruptive. It rearranged the dynamics, rewired the power structure, and forced people to confront who they really are around you. And deep down, they know the truth. You're not evolving to prove something to them. You're evolving because you were always meant to outgrow the rooms that tried to shrink you. Their reactions say it all. Their discomfort reveals everything, and their silence expresses the most. They swear you changed, but deep down, you know the truth. You finally stopped dimming your own light to make other people comfortable in their shadows. Because the second you stepped into your actual potential, the second you stood in your real power, the second you stopped apologizing for who you are, the whole landscape around you started shifting. Not because you became someone new, but because you stop pretending to be less. People don't worry about your evolution. They worry about the version of themselves that gets revealed when they stand next to it. Your growth highlights their stagnation. Your courage highlights their excuses. Your discipline highlights their laziness. Your emotional intelligence highlights their immaturity. You didn't become too much. They were simply operating on not enough. And the wildest part, your silence is what moved them the most. Because silence from someone who used to explain themselves, who used to justify themselves, who used to overthink every move, who used to stay small to keep the peace, means only one thing. You finally know your value. And when someone who knows their value stops engaging, stops entertaining, stops reacting, that's when people start worrying. Not because they lost access to you, but because your absence reveals how little they ever brought to the table in the first place. That's why they suddenly act strange. Why they watch you more closely now than ever. Why they whisper your name in rooms where your name shouldn't even matter. Why they keep waiting for the old you to return. The you they could underestimate. The you they could talk over. The you they assumed would stay predictable. But that version of you? Gone. Settled. And the world they built around that version is shifting with it. You walked into this new chapter with clarity. They watched you walk in with concern. Not concern of you, concern of who they become when they can't place you, pin you down, or categorize you anymore. Your evolution forced them to face themselves, and most people aren't built for that kind of honesty. So here you stand, calmer, wiser, sharper, watching everything fall into place exactly how it was meant to. Not because you pushed harder, but because you finally aligned with who you really are. And that is what unsettles them the most. They tested you because they thought you were predictable, a quiet spirit, a steady presence, someone who would bend before you ever shifted, someone who would shrink before you ever stood tall. Someone who would accept the bare minimum and call it grace. They mistook your patience for weakness, your silence for confusion, your humility for lack of power, your calmness for lack of capability. But then, something shifted. You stopped responding the way they expected, stopped giving them the reactions they rehearsed for, stopped accepting the roles they wrote for you, stopped carrying the weight they kept throwing on your shoulders, stopped letting people push you just to see how far you'd bend, because you weren't built to bend. You were built to transcend. And the moment they realized that, the moment they finally saw who you actually are, they froze. Because nothing concerns people more than someone who refuses to be guided by guilt, by doubt, by pressure, by unease. They kept pushing, kept measuring, kept pressing, kept testing, until their own tests dismantled the illusion they were hiding behind. They expected you to strain. Instead, you upgraded. They expected you to fold. Instead, you unfolded into your highest form. They expected you to run out of strength. Instead, you tapped into a level they didn't even know existed. You didn't pass their tests. You outgrew them. And that's why they talk different now. Why they act cautious around you. Why they walk on careful steps when your name comes up. Why they whisper instead of speak. Why they watch instead of approach. Why they fall silent when you enter the room. Because they finally understand. You're not someone with limits. You're someone with layers, someone whose potential can't be predicted, someone whose energy can't be measured, someone whose mind can't be mapped, someone whose strength can't be charted, someone who wasn't built for their tests. You were built for something far beyond them. You're not unstoppable because you're loud. You're unstoppable because you're inevitable. And the ones who tested you, the ones who doubted you, the ones who tried to put boundaries around someone with no boundaries, now carry the weight of knowing. They didn't discover your limit. They discovered their own. Hello, my dear mastermind. They've been checking their files, going back through their records, cross-referencing their databases, looking for the profile they created on you years ago. The psychological assessment, the behavioral patterns, the predictability scores, the limitations they documented, the weaknesses they cataloged. They're pulling up everything they thought they knew about you, and none of it matches. Not even close. The person standing in front of them now, the energy emanating from you, the frequency you're operating at, it doesn't align with a single data point they have on file. It's like you're a completely different person wearing the same face, and that's exactly what deeply unsettles them. Because people don't change like this. Not according to their models, not according to their research, not according to everything they thought they understood about human behavior. People evolve gradually, predictably, within measurable parameters. But you didn't evolve. You transformed, completely, and they have no explanation for it. But here's what they don't realize yet. What you did during that quiet period wasn't random. It was intentional. Let me tell you what they had on you. What was in those files? They had you mapped. Your triggers, your patterns, your responses. They knew what made you react, what made you retreat, what made you compromise. They had predicted your trajectory based on your history, your conditioning, your circumstances. According to their records, you were supposed to stay within certain boundaries. You were categorized, filed, understood. Just another predictable pattern in their system. They documented your insecurities, the ones you tried to hide, but they could see clearly. Your need for validation, your fear of rejection, your tendency to people please, your habit of shrinking to make others comfortable. All of it was noted, recorded, used to predict your future choices and behaviors. They even had timelines based on your patterns. They predicted when you'd settle, when you'd compromise, when you'd accept that certain versions of success weren't meant for you. Think about it like this. They had you scheduled to plateau by 35, accept limitations by 40, stop reaching entirely by 45. But then something happened that wasn't in their predictions. You went quiet, and in that silence, you became someone they had no file for. You disappeared so completely that they started creating theories. Maybe you gave up. Maybe you couldn't handle the pressure. Maybe you finally accepted your limitations. They had narratives, explanations, stories that made sense to them. What they didn't know was that every day you were silent. You were making choices they couldn't track. Small decisions that seemed insignificant. Reading when you used to scroll. Thinking when you used to react. Building when you used to consume. None of it was dramatic. None of it was visible. But every single choice was rewiring you at a fundamental level. While they were writing you off, you were writing a new version of yourself. You withdrew from the spaces where they were monitoring you, stopped performing for the audiences that were documenting you, stepped away from the environments where they thought they had you figured out. And in that silence, in that withdrawal, you began changing in ways their models couldn't track, because they can only measure what they can see. They can only document what you show them, and you stopped showing them anything. You went internal, deep internal, into spaces where their observation tools couldn't reach. While they thought you were struggling, you were studying. While they assumed you were stuck, you were evolving. While they believed you were the same person just going through a difficult phase, you were actually shedding an old version and rebuilding into something completely different. The transformation was happening in ways they didn't have instruments to detect. You weren't just changing your circumstances, you were changing your entire operating system, rewiring your core patterns, becoming someone fundamentally different at the identity level. And then you emerged, not with an announcement, not with a big reveal. You just showed up one day as this new version, and the moment they saw you, the moment they felt your presence, nothing aligned with what they expected. The person in front of them didn't match the profile, didn't fit the pattern, didn't behave according to the predictions. They pulled up the old files thinking there must have been some mistake, checked the documentation thinking they must have missed something, but there wasn't, because the person they had on record simply doesn't exist anymore. That version is gone, completely. And here's the beautiful part. You didn't just outgrow their expectations. You made their entire system of measurement irrelevant. The way you move now, it's different. Not just physically, energetically. The old you moved with a certain carefulness, a need to fit in, a concern about how you were perceived. This new version moves with certainty, with a quiet confidence that doesn't seek validation, with a presence that doesn't apologize for the space it takes up. The way you speak now, it's transformed. The old you measured words carefully, filtered thoughts to be acceptable, adjusted communication to please others. This version speaks truth without decoration, expresses thoughts without filtering, communicates with a directness that wasn't there before. So they're confused, deeply confused, because in their understanding of human nature, this kind of transformation shouldn't be possible. And here's what makes it worse for them. They can't even explain the change to others. When someone asks about you, they struggle to articulate what's different. It's not one thing they can point to, it's everything. Your entire frequency has shifted. They'll say things like something's different, or they've changed, but they can't identify what specifically changed, because everything changed. Your energy, your standards, your boundaries, your presence. Even your silence carries weight now. The way you used to fill awkward pauses, now you let them sit. The way you used to over-explain yourself, now you simply state and move on. The way you used to seek reassurance, now you trust your own knowing. They're experiencing cognitive dissonance. Their brain can't reconcile the old data with the new reality. They're trying to figure it out. What happened during that quiet period? What catalyst created this change? Was it a person you met? A book you read? An experience you had? They're looking for the external explanation, the logical cause, the identifiable trigger. Because accepting that you simply chose to become someone completely different, that you chose transformation over comfort, feels too destabilizing to their worldview. If you can change this completely, if you can become this unrecognizable, if you can transform so fundamentally that their entire assessment of you becomes outdated, then what does that say about their system? What does that say about their ability to predict human behavior? What does that say about the limitations they place on people? So what do they see now when they look at you? They see confidence where they recorded insecurity. They see clarity where they documented confusion. They see boundaries where they noted people-pleasing tendencies. They see self-respect where they observed self-doubt. They see sovereignty where they cataloged dependency. For instance, the person who used to ask permission to speak now holds rooms with silence. The person who apologized for existing now occupies space without explanation. None of it matches. And what they're about to realize changes everything. It's not just surface changes. It's not like you're performing confidence or displaying strength. This is real. This is integrated. This is who you actually are now at a core level. They can feel the authenticity of it, can sense that this isn't a mask you're wearing, but a truth you've embodied. And that makes it even more confusing because transformation like this isn't supposed to happen this completely. They're trying to update their files now, attempting to create a new profile that matches the current version, running new assessments, making new predictions. But here's the problem. You're not stable enough for them to document. Not because you're chaotic, because you're still evolving, still transforming. Every time they think they've figured out the new you, you've already shifted again. What's starting to dawn on them is that this isn't a phase. This isn't temporary confidence you're borrowing. This isn't a mask you'll eventually take off. This is permanent. This is who you are now. And that realization is hitting them in waves. First, they thought you were faking it. Then they thought you'd crack under pressure. Then they thought time would reveal the old you underneath. But none of that happened. Pressure didn't shake you. It refined you. Time didn't expose weakness. It revealed more strength. Challenge didn't make you retreat. It made you expand. Every test they thought would bring back the old version just proves that version is gone forever. And that permanence is what they're struggling to accept. Because if you can change this completely and never go back, what does that mean about their own potential? What does that mean about the limitations they've accepted for themselves? They want to know your new patterns so they can predict your behavior. But your patterns now are too sophisticated for their models. They want to identify your new weaknesses so they can know where you're vulnerable. But the vulnerabilities they're searching for no longer define you. They want to find your new triggers so they can influence your responses. But you're operating from a center they can't access. And here's what keeps them unsettled. The version they had on record isn't hiding, isn't dormant, isn't going to resurface when things get difficult. That version is finished. Not metaphorically finished. Completely concluded. You ended it. Intentionally. Fully. And you're never going back. The person who needed their approval. Gone. The person who feared their judgment. Removed. The person who shrank to make them comfortable. Released. The person who operated from scarcity and fear. Left behind. You didn't just change some behaviors. You concluded an entire identity and formed a completely new one. And this new version, it was built from the ground up using completely different foundations, different values, different priorities, different understanding of what matters. You're not the old version refined. You're a completely different operating system. And there's no return path. This new version of you runs on completely different programming. The old you operated from external validation. This version operates from internal knowing. The old you was motivated by fear of judgment. This version is guided by alignment with truth. The old you made decisions to please others. This version makes decisions to honor self. But here's the shift that changed everything. The person on record was built by conditioning, by other people's expectations, by societal programming. This new version was built from the inside out, created by you, for you, based on your actual values, not inherited ones, based on your authentic desires, not conditioned ones, based on your true nature, not your adapted personality. This version is genuine in a way the old version never was. And genuine can't be faked, can't be copied, can't be analyzed using tools designed to measure performance and pretense. Their assessment methods are built for evaluating masks, roles, personas. But you're not wearing a mask anymore. You're being real. And real is unreadable to people who only know how to interact with performance. There's a profound freedom in becoming unrecognizable to the system that tried to define you, in being so different from your documented profile that their predictions no longer apply, in transforming so completely that their old understanding of you becomes useless, because when they can't categorize you, they can't manage you. When they can't predict you, they can't influence you. When they can't recognize you, they can't treat you according to their old strategies. You've become a variable they don't have formulas for, a pattern they don't have models to decode. This freedom isn't about rebellion. It's about transcendence. You're not fighting their system. You're operating outside it entirely. You're not proving them wrong. You're making their assessments irrelevant. You're not seeking their approval. You're making their judgment ineffective. And what they're starting to understand unsettles them. You're not unpredictable because you're chaotic. You're unpredictable because you're aligned. And aligned forces don't negotiate. There's been an internal shift, and they can feel it. Not the kind of power that announces itself, not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that simply exists and reorganizes everything around it. You're not trying to overpower conversations, yet people listen differently when you speak. You're not trying to control outcomes, yet situations tend to move in your direction. You're not trying to unsettle anyone, yet something about your presence makes people think twice before testing you. This is the power of someone who stopped seeking power and started embodying it, stopped chasing respect and started commanding it through character, stopped demanding space and started occupying it naturally. And they don't know how to respond to this kind of power because it doesn't play by the rules they understand. It doesn't compete. It doesn't defend. It doesn't need to prove itself. It just is, going forward. They're gonna keep trying to figure you out. Keep attempting to create new profiles. Keep looking for ways to make you fit into their understanding. But they won't succeed. Not because you're trying to be mysterious, because you're authentic. And authenticity at your level of awareness is inherently unclassifiable. You're going to keep evolving, keep transforming, keep becoming more of who you really are. And every time they think they've updated their understanding, you'll have already moved beyond it. Not to confuse them, just because you're committed to continuous growth, committed to never settling into a fixed identity that can be documented and predicted. Here's the deeper truth about why you don't match anything on record. You were never meant to be the person they tried to document. That person was a compromise. a survival strategy, a version you created to navigate a world that demanded you be smaller than you are. But something in you always knew you were more than their profiles suggested. And when you finally honored that knowing, when you finally gave yourself permission to become that person, everything changed. The files they had on you, those weren't just documents. They were limitations, boxes they put you in, ceilings they placed above you, stories they told themselves about what you were capable of. And every time you outgrow their assessment, every time you exceed their predictions, every time you become more than they thought possible, you're not just proving them wrong. You're freeing yourself from their limited vision. You're outgrowing their ceiling. You're stepping out of their box. You're rewriting their story. And the most powerful part, you're doing it without their permission, without their approval, without their understanding. You don't need them to recognize your transformation for it to be real. You don't need them to update their files for you to be free. You don't need them to understand who you've become for you to continue becoming more. The version they see now, this is closer to who you've always been beneath the conditioning. This is what emerges when you stop performing and start being. This is what happens when you stop trying to fit their expectations and start honoring your authentic nature. This is you without the costume, without the mask, without the personality you built to survive. So let them be confused. Let them struggle to update their records. Let them try to understand how someone can transform this completely. While they're processing the gap between who you were and who you are now, you'll continue evolving into who you're becoming. The version of you they see today doesn't match anything they had documented before. And that's a good thing. It means you're finally becoming authentic, finally stepping into your true strength, finally expressing who you really are beneath the performance. You're not who they thought you were. You're not who they predicted you'd become. You've grown into someone entirely different, someone they never anticipated, someone their frameworks couldn't forecast, someone their systems couldn't define. And that version, the one that doesn't fit any previous record, that's the real you, the you that was always there, the you that no longer needs permission, the you that doesn't return to being reduced, labeled, or limited. Welcome to being unrecognizable. It's exactly where you're meant to be.